The title of the panel is A French Civil War in the Middle East. We have 3 speakers. We'll go in the order that they're listed in the program. Our first speaker is Jean Avenel, is a professor emeritus at Université Paris 12. He is president of the Commission Française d'Histoire Militaire. After Professor Avenel, we'll hear from Shirley Le Penne, who is a PhD student in government at Cornell University, specializing in political theory. And finally, our third set of speakers are Professor Brannon Wheeler and Professor Deborah Wheeler, who will be presenting on critical race theory and the new French Islam. Professor Brannon Wheeler teaches the history of religion, Middle East, and Islamic studies at the U.S. Naval Academy. Professor Deborah Wheeler is a Middle East specialist in the Department of Political Science at the United States Naval Academy. So thank you to our audience and to our speakers for being here. We look forward to your presentations.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm very pleased to be once again here with ASMEA. So I will speak today about a relatively poorly known event that happened during World War II, and I called it a French Civil War in Lebanon. So I will organize my presentation. I will first study the international legal aspect, then the French political aspect and the problem of the war, and then I will speak about what it's called Operation Exporter, that is the war that lasted 1 month between French Free forces and Vichy government forces and British forces. And then I will give you some information about the consequences. So if we consider the international legal aspect of the context, you remember that the Sykes-Picot Secret Agreement set the spheres of influence between the Great Britain and France in what is now Syria, Lebanon, and for France, and Israel and Jordan for Great Britain. The official mandate given by the League of Nations to France was on April 25, 1920, but it came into effect on September 29, 1923. According to the mandate, the renewal of the mandate had to take place every 3 years, and the mandate was supposed to end in 1943. This means that the mandate was not a protectorate. It was something specific to the League of Nations. The mandate was what was called at that time a Class A mandate, which means that the mandatory country had to help the mandated ones to build an efficient administration, to create a local police, to be responsible of foreign policies. And in fact, the mandatory country was acting as a trustee. So France acknowledged the independence of Syria and Lebanon in 1933, and this independence was supposed to take place in 1939. But the French Parliament did not ratify the treaty, and in 1939, because of the beginning of the war, the independence was postponed. According to the Article 22 of the mandate from the League of Nations, that fact is that the mandate does not end. If the mandate did not end on time, it means that it will end in different conditions that the initial mandate had set. So this point is very important because the United States of America had signed a convention which stipulates that they would not recognize any change in the mandate. So it was signed on April 4th, 1924. and it's very important for understanding what happened later. Another legal aspect was the French-Italy Armistice Convention that was signed after the French defeat against Germany, but also against Italy, on June 25, 1940. According to this convention, there must be the demobilization of French troops in all the French Empire. The Italians wanted especially this because of the French had the territory of Djibouti that is near Ethiopia, and it was very important for Italy to have a French demobilization in this territory. But the demobilization was also in the other part of the French Empire. So that meant that there was a de facto transfer of military authority to Italy. So the mandate was not conform to the original mandate that was decided by the League of Nations. To sum up, according to the international legal framework, Syria and Lebanon were under a mandate from the League of Nations in 1941 when the war took place, but I mean the expedition exporter took place. Why? Because in fact the League of Nations was functioning at this time. We all think that after the beginning of the war the League of Nations was over, but in fact it was not, and it was functioning, of course, not really, but theoretically it was functioning. And according to the mandate, only the mandate committee was allowed to recognize the end of the mandate. This mandate committee was made of 7 members. 4 of them were living in 1941 in occupied territories by Germany, so they couldn't travel. So it was impossible for the League of Nations to certify the end of the mandate. And as we will see, the General de Gaulle, who was at the head of the French Free Forces, took advantage from this obligation. The second point is, I forgot to. So here is a letter. This part of the world, Syria and Lebanon, was called Levant. So here is an example of a letter that was sent from Levant. So here is the map of the French Levant. So the other problem was the war in Iraq and the World War II context. So according to the June 1940 Armistice Convention between France and Germany, France would fight against any aggressor of its colony and of its territories under the League of Nations mandate. In 1941, the Middle East was a very important strategic zone for Great Britain. There was the oil from Iraq, so it had to protect Iraq and also, of course, to protect the Suez Canal from the Italian army and from the German Africa Corps that was very effective. Furthermore, remember that the Nazis, Germany, were occupying Greece and Croatia. So Germany was completing a pincer movement against British troops in the Middle East and North Africa. And in May 1941, an important event happened. The Rashid Ali Putsch in Iraq on April 1, 1941. according to the treaty between Iraq and Great Britain could maintain 2 air bases in Iraq. And in case of war, Iraq would let the British use its airports and harbors. When Rashid Ali came to power, he cancelled the treaty and allowed the German planes, the Luftwaffe, to set a base in Mosul. So for England, it was very upsetting. And Ali was in favor of Hitler. So, of course, the British responded. The putsch didn't last. Ali was overthrown on April 30. But for Britain, it was very important because theoretically, the German planes could have used Iraq airports. Another point is that in 1941 was signed what is called the Paris Protocols between the head of the French Vichy government, Amiral Darlan, and the German ambassador in Paris. According to this protocol, German airplanes and ships were allowed to use Syrian and Lebanese airports, railroads, and harbors, and of course to send help to Ali. So, for Great Britain, it was necessary to stop with this influence. In fact, Germany never ratified the protocols, but it was very dangerous from the Great Britain. I remember also that the Italian warplanes used once French airports in Syria to bomb Haifa, and this is the only time when they bombed Haifa. So at that time, the Vichy, so pro-Nazi government, had about 30,000 soldiers in Lebanon and Syria. The occupation, these soldiers never fought during the war, and they stayed in Lebanon. But you know, these soldiers and mainly officers were in favor of the Vichy government. And that was a problem for the Free Front forces that were few. And General de Gaulle, who was once again at the end of the Free French forces, hoped to get more soldiers invading Lebanon and Syria, and he hoped to convince the soldiers from the Vichy government to join him and to fight against Germany later. So that's one of the reasons why the French Force Libre went along with the British against worrying against the other troops from the Vichy government. According to the political situation in Syria and Lebanon, I had access to the diplomatic archives of France, and also to the archives of the League of Nations in Geneva. And according to the documents I can look at during my investigation, there was no real problem with the local population. The local population, of course, there was an opposition to the French occupation, but it was not very important. There was once in February 1941 a social crisis that is called la crise du pain, because there was not enough bread for people other than French people. But generally speaking, according to the reports I could read in the archive, the French archive, there was no real opposition, let's say real useful opposition to the French occupation. The only thing is that the people, mainly civil people, were subjected to British propaganda, and many people were hoping that there would be an occupation by British forces, and that occupation will stop the economic problem in Lebanon. So in front of this, of them was the French forces of General de Gaulle, Free French forces. So according, I don't know, I have, how long? 1 minute? Sorry. So I will, I hope, of course, the General de Gaulle was in opposition with the Vichy government, and he hoped once again to get more troops from these Vichy forces that were in Lebanon. That's the reason why in these three reasons, legal aspect, war in Iraq, and Free France forces that wanted to get more men, there was the Operation Exporter that began in May, and they attacked the Levant. According to 3 roads, one to Beirut, one to Damascus, and another one on the east. And the British army sent a troop from Jordania at that time. And so the war lasted 1 month, more or less. There were many. It was a war at the time on the Mediterranean Sea between the French fleet and the British fleet, and on the ground. So there was an armistice on July 26, and so the war stopped. The French government refused to give the mandate to General de Gaulle, and they give it to Britain. But there was an agreement between the British and the French, and at the end, the General de Gaulle government took the mandate from the Vichy government for Lebanon and Syria. And so there was, but this was a victory, political victory for General de Gaulle, because thanks to this, he had an international reconnaissance from the League of Nations and, of course, from other allied governments, especially the British government and the American government later, and also most of Latin American governments. So, but from a military point of view, it was a defeat. First, because there was a civil war between French soldiers and French Free Force soldiers and French Vichy government soldiers. The most important battle was between France soldiers, was with the Légion étrangère, the Foreign Legion. There were soldiers of the Foreign Legion who fought along with Vichy government forces, and others who fought with Free French forces. And it's the only time in the history of the Foreign Legion. The Foreign Legion was created in 1832. So it's the only time when they fought each other. And it's a very bad memory in France. So it's one of the reasons why we don't speak very much about this campaign. And apart from this campaign, there was a lot. Australian soldiers were involved, and they had most of the losses, military losses, were from this for the Australian people, the soldiers and officers. So that more or less the story. And then, of course, after the Allies won in North Africa, so it was less important to Lebanon and Syria were less important for France and for the Allies. So in 1943, the General de Gaulle declares that Lebanon and Syria would be independent, and the independence was granted at that time. So that's more or less the story with a resume. Thank you very much.
Okay, hi everybody. Thank you so much for being here. It's great to see familiar faces, new faces. I'm very honored to be here. So I will talk today about Colonial Paranoia, French Carcerality amidst the Algerian struggle for independence. My work focuses on the interplay between colonialism and incarceration, and specifically I look at the colonial carceral nexus of France and Algeria, past and present. So this is a work in progress. This is part of my dissertation project, and in this specific presentation I drew on extensive archive work that I did in the Archives nationales d'Outre-mer in Aix-en-Provence. So part of the kind of like official documents that you will see in this presentation come from this archive, and I'm happy to talk more about it. So I'll start by mentioning that the carceral connection between France and Algeria is not new. Soon after its colonization in 1830, Algeria turned into a prolific carceral site to which several French regimes expelled their political prisoners. This use of land for carceral purposes reached new heights 8 decades later, when during the Algerian War of Independence, commonly bracketed from 1954 to 1962, Algerian dissidents were imprisoned not only in Algeria, but in mainland France too, for betrayal and terrorism. So this is a picture of the oldest prison in Algeria, Barberousse, now called the Serkadji prison. So I would like here to bring the case of one of such dissidents. His name was Abderrahman Taleb. Taleb was a chemistry student at the University of Algiers. He was recruited 2 years into the war by Yassef Saadi, the head of the FLN. So the FLN is basically the Front de Libération Nationale, the Algerian National Liberation Front, which is the leading nationalist movement of the Algerian anti-colonial struggle. So basically, Yassef Saadi asked Abderrahman Taleb to use his skills in chemistry to build explosives for the movement. Taleb obeyed, but soon enough he decided that he did not want to participate in the making of bombs aimed at killing civilians, and so he was expelled from the movement. Taleb was caught a year later by the French army. The military court trialed him and sentenced him to death 3 times. Of course, one can only die once. Taleb was executed by guillotine in April 1958 in the Barberousse prison of Algiers. So I'm not using here Taleb's example to praise or denounce his refusal to use violence during the struggle. What is interesting for me in this case is that Taleb's case sheds light on France's troubled psychology, its colonial paranoia. So to put it briefly, I take France's paranoia to be multi-layered. It is about France's fear of itself, France's fear of losing itself, and then France's fear of the other and of fearing to lose the other. And I know it's a bit abstract right now, and I'm happy to provide very concrete examples later in the Q&A. So clearly, Taleb was a political dissident that the French authorities needed to annihilate. But he was also the embodiment of the complexities that allegiance entails. On the one hand, he was an FLN member, but on the other hand, he stood against the movement. This could have been an opportunity for France to convert him back into its rank. But instead, by sentencing Taleb with death by guillotine, the French authorities sent a message that Taleb was irredeemable, indeed irreparable in the eyes of France. France opted for the quicker solution, undermining the long-term consequences that this sentencing will have on its own legitimacy among the French and the international community. But more importantly, France denied the impact that Taleb's sentence will have on the Algerians themselves, favoring a kind of like retributive approach over perhaps forgiveness. The regime ultimately signaled to the Algerians that they could not be redeemable for their betrayal of the nation. In a way, they could never be French again if they were ever. So ultimately, by guillotining Taleb, France did not only amputate a part of itself, the Algerians, but it accelerated the decay of its colonial dream, and here, of course, I'm using the word dream critically, further estranging the part of itself that completes the whole. At the end of the day, if Taleb couldn't make it back to France, who could? So Taleb's story was only one example of the extensive carceral machinery put in place by the French regime during the war, which France actually acknowledged as such only in 1999. The colonial authorities during the war substituted the political nature of the struggle with the criminalization of its members, using exceptionality as legal device and imprisonment as carceral device. So here I would like to focus on the legal device to briefly contextualize France's politics of carcerality within the broader legal framework that supported it and within which it operated. So the French authorities quickly realized that the guillotine and other military methods alone were not sufficient to win the war. They needed to be backed up with legal legitimacy. French General Raoul Salan bluntly reiterates this point in a statement when he says, in an era, I'm quoting, in an era where strict military means have proved unsuitable, the subversive nature of the rebellion has led the army to implement appropriate administrative or judicial means. Its weapons are the text of codes, the laws, the decrees, and other instructions. Thus, through the struggle, France justified the legality of its actions through the establishment of a state of emergency, indeed a state of exception that granted special powers to its functionaries. Although it appears as an expression of power, this colonial strategy, I think, speaks less to France's power and more to its insecurity and the insufficiency of the means of law, which haven't been designed for periods of insurrections. So one of these special powers was actually to allow the Minister of Interior to pronounce house arrest over any person whose activity proves to be dangerous for security reasons and for the public order. Another, perhaps more important special power was the transfer of the legal authority of the state from the judiciary to the military. So the military was now allowed to enforce the law over a vast and unspecified array of crimes on the basis of a simple decree. So this has huge implications. First, it allowed France to redefine the nature of crime by qualifying any suspicious behavior as a threat to the national integrity of the territory. Second, and by extension, by changing what crime is, it allowed France to change what punishment is and ought to be. And special treatments such as torture or death by guillotine were frequently employed. More importantly, the appointment of military courts resulted in the imprisonment of FLN members at unprecedented rates. So here you can see how the number of cases exponentially increase over time. So this brings us to the second major device. So I mentioned the legal device. Now I want to focus on imprisonment as a carceral device. So specifically, I will focus on the category of political prisoner. So typically, political prisoners are combatants captured and incarcerated during war by their opponents on the basis of the political agenda that they defend. They are or should be protected under the Geneva Conventions for war prisoners. Political prisoners are thus different from another category of prisoners, which are called prisonniers de droit commun or common law prisoners, who are basically incarcerated for crimes unmotivated by political aspirations, such as stealing or committing a homicide. So what's interesting is that during the Algerian struggle, the category of political prisoner was instrumentalized both by France and by FLN militants, who respectively used it to enhance the depoliticization of the struggle in the case of France, or the repoliticization of the struggle in the case of the FLN. So for France, prison was a site where political agency could be suppressed. That's what prison do. Both the courts and the prison administration assimilated the FLN's actions to mere criminality, relegating them to the status of common law prisoners, which means basically FLN members were treated as common law prisoners. They were not recognized as political prisoners. So their political agency was basically denied during the war. The strategy was clear. By denying considering the FLN's actions as political, the French authorities could get away with granting them the status of political prisoners, thus, as I mentioned, effectively discrediting the FLN's political essence. So here, this is the prison of Fresnes in mainland France, where the highest number of FLN members were incarcerated. Concretely, in prison, FLN members were split up and placed in the same cells as other common law prisoners, preventing them from politically organizing. They were also denied the privileges usually granted to political prisoners, such as having access to newspapers or family visits, even in regard to capital punishment, and I think that's a very disturbing and interesting fact. FLN prisoners were denied the privilege, if one can speak of such things, of being killed by the means usually deployed for political prisoners. So in fact, the French authorities opted to kill FLN members with a guillotine, which is usually exclusively employed for common law prisoners, rather than death by firing squad, which would have been the appropriate death sentence for political prisoners. So even in kind of like the application of the death sentence, France really wanted to maintain the differentiation between political and common law prisoners, and denying the political agency even in the way of killing the FLN members. As General Raoul Salan in 1957 said, I mean, he expressed his reluctance to the idea of shooting people convicted by military tribunals, claiming that, quote, applying to terrorists a mode of execution traditionally reserved for acts of war would make rebel propaganda the object of an interpretation that did not seem appropriate to provoke, end quote. So that was from France's standpoint. But for FLN members, of course, prison was a different story. It served as a prolific site where political agency could be achieved and the struggle kept alive. As political prisoner Mohan Zegag puts it in his memoir, confinement did not bring our will to fight, as one might think. We continued to fight the colonial ideology, which considered us as second-class citizens. This inferiorization fueled our determination to continue our struggle even in prison, end quote. From their cells, concretely, imprisoned FLN leaders created Detainees Committee, or NIDHAM, whose mission was to enforce the FLN's political agenda onto the prisoners. So they had educational programs, and as you can see, the organization kind of like performed in a very organized, hierarchical, and intentional way. FLN members in prison also performed opposition through routinized acts of disobedience. So at times, prisoners shouted slurs, slogans, songs, banged on bars, drew graffitis, resisted body counts and ward searches, boycotted court visits, engaged in smuggling, track distribution, and clandestine correspondences. They also organized clandestine meetings, fought against ideologically opposite groups and against the prison administration. Occasionally, they attempted to escape prison, sometimes effectively succeeding in doing so. They resorted to hunger strikes, but never to suicide. Perhaps ironically, they petitioned against the administration's abuses of authority. And the reason why I'm mentioning all these kind of like techniques of disobedience is because they are actually present in the archives from the standpoint of the administration who addresses them. Ultimately, this explosive combination of legal and carceral devices that I've been talking about resulted in the fabrication of an unprecedented carceral dispositif. So I think it was unprecedented in three major ways. First, in terms of its extent, the carceral dispositif was all-encompassing and took diverse forms. From official prisons in which defendants and convicts were detained to military camps, regrouping camps, internment camps, and indeed, as historian Raphaël Branche puts it, police station cellars, tanks or vineyard cellars, farms, villas, schools, sheds, disused barracks, former summer camps, clinics, hospitals, and other buildings. So basically, in fact, anything that could be transformed into a place of detention was used to confine prisoners. Second, it was unprecedented in geographic terms. Algerians were incarcerated both in Algeria and in France, taken away from their home country. This is, for instance, the case of FLN member Jacqueline Guérouge, who was transferred from the Barberousse prison in Algiers to another prison in Algiers, then to Marseille, Paris, the north of France, then back to Marseille, back to Algiers, back to France in Toulon, Toulouse, Pau, Rouen, and Rennes, creating not only a life of confinement, but also a life of forced and unexpected itinerance. So I think this is interesting because it kind of urges us to rethink the prison as a mobile site and not necessarily as a sedentary platform. Finally, the magnitude of the carceral dispositif was unprecedented in terms of its consequences. In Algeria, as historian Benjamin Stora observed, there was not a single family that has not been impacted by the French carceral system in a way or another. So in part, this has to do with the fact that the French authorities legislated that any person could be arrested at the discretion of the military on the basis of simple suspicion. Of course, this is what we call today racial profiling. So if the war was the main reason for the development of such an extensive carceral dispositif, the end of the war should have marked the end of the carceral dispositif altogether. However, today we witness a lingering of the colonial carceral connection in France. So basically, this is what I'm interested in deciphering in my dissertation project. I am interested at exploring the intergenerational incarceration of FLN offspring in French prisons today to shed light on the extent to which French carcerality has been interrupted and exacerbated. So this is my presentation. Thank you so much for listening.
Professor Brannon Wheeler and Professor Deborah Wheeler.
Get this to work.
We had a debate about who should speak first. I let him.
Is it working? It's not working.
It's a rarity.
I'm getting a security alert.
Security alert.
Yeah. What does that mean?
What'd you do?
I didn't do anything.
Help protect me from my,
Do I need to do one? Cancel it? Oh, okay. I can't see it. Okay, cool. Okay, it was good. Let me turn on the thing here. Okay. So thank you for coming and letting us share our paper with you. In November of 2020, an open letter was published in Le Monde 1 month after President Emmanuel Macron's speech introducing a new law to fight radical separatism that leads to Islamist terrorism. In the speech, Macron blamed critical race theory, his quote, entirely imported from the United States, for France's Muslim problem. The open letter, signed by 100 French academics, presented a manifesto. This is the website. Supporting Macron's speech, and specifically in their words, his claim that, in rough translation, indigenous and racist ideologies and decoloniality transferred from North American campuses are responsible for the spread of Islamo-Gauchism or Islamo-leftism. And later they go on to say that it is responsible for, apologize for, and ultimately produce the type of radical Islam responsible for the beheading of Samuel Paty 2 weeks earlier.
The origins of this project are multifaceted. Ironically, in 2020, both that professor and this professor received a note that we were no longer allowed, as members of the Department of Defense teaching in the military academy, to teach critical race theory, that we didn't do training in topics that might affect the patriotism and worldviews of future soldiers who had taken an oath and would repeat to take an oath to defend the Constitution, that this could be bad for morale. The irony involved with these transcontinental critiques of critical race theory and its threat led us to ask a question about why Macron thought that critical race theory was a threat to France and its identity. The irony also had deep roots in the fact that as a graduate student at the University of Chicago, I had imported almost wholesale the theory of Foucault and others dealing with identity politics to provide a nuanced critique of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict characterized by the politics of representation in the First Intifada. Who was right? Is it the French that created the foundation for critical race theory? Or is it critical race theory that is challenging the foundations of French identity? Interestingly, this conversation has gained steam in the United States, especially with the rulings of the governor of Florida to say that you can't teach critical race theory in a government institution in Florida. So the debate has not ended, and now we would like to look at more details about this particular threat in France.
So obviously our paper is longer, but we thought we would just kind of summarize it in these 3 points here. So as many of you know, secondary school teacher Samuel Paty was beheaded by a Chechen Muslim refugee in a Paris suburb in October of 2020. A later audio recording revealed that the killing was motivated by the assailant's anger at the fact that the teacher had shown students 2 caricatures of the Prophet Muhammad from the controversial publication by Charlie Hebdo that in 2012 that led to the shooting in 2015. The 2012 publication had been a reprint of the 2006 publication. They did it because in 2011 their offices were firebombed, and many of you know that the 2006 publication was actually a republication of something from the Yilin Post, and they added 12 cartoons of their own, some of which depicted the Prophet Muhammad naked, and apparently those were the pictures that this teacher showed. So these are quotes from the law, and this is a rundown of terrorist events that occurred between 2011 and 2020, and this timeline attempts to try to show you how it goes from 2005 up to 2020. So the law that Macron proposed, which was eventually voted in to law by the lower house it was voted into the lower house in February of 2021 and passed by the Senate in 2021, had 51 articles and 84 pages long, and these are some of the various things. So for example, medical practitioners are banned from issuing virginity certificates. Residency permits can be revoked if a person is in a polygamous marriage. And one that's important to me, you weren't allowed to restrict hours at a pool to just women swimming or men swimming. Had to be both together at the same time.
We spent some time on the ground in France in 2020 and also in 2022, and so we are frequenters of the public swimming pools that exist throughout France. So limited hours, since we swim together, for men or women would have been a real problem.
So nowhere in the law is Islam mentioned, but clearly the law is targeting Muslims in France. This comes in the context of a series of laws in France that attempted to ban the hijab in public, starting in 1989, 1994, and again in 2004. The last law was actually overturned when the United Nations sued France and was successful. So the second thing we looked at were these non-France zones. The Republican Values Law seems to presuppose that there exists throughout France certain neighborhoods or zones that are absent of French law and culture. In a speech that Macron gave, he said, is that the right one? Yeah, there we go. That it's the ghettoization which our republic has allowed to occur. We've created neighborhoods where the promise of the republic no longer has been kept. What's interesting is that where did this idea come from? Macron seems to have picked up the idea of Islamist zones from the Americas media's conflation of so-called European no-go zones and the French zones urbaines sensibles. The first conflation of the ZUS, for short, with no-go zones occurred in a 2006 article published by Danielle Pipes, founder of the Middle East Forum, entitled The 750 No-Go Zones of France. He publishes a number of different articles, and for the most part, through all of this time, there was no reference or linking of the no-go zones with Muslims. But after the attacks on Charlie Hebdo in 2015, the full conflation of the ZUSs with the Muslim no-go zones becomes politically current. In two separate interviews on Fox News, Sean Hannity, the Fox News host, and Steve Emerson, founder of the Investigative Project on Terrorism, referred to no-go zones in France. After the French ambassador to the U.S. rejected the claim, Emerson cited the ZUSs as evidence. Later, both Emerson and Fox had to issue apologies after the UK Prime Minister David Cameron called Emerson an idiot, quote unquote, and Bobby Jindal, the then Republican presidential candidate, repeated the claim in CNN interview a day later, and I don't think I actually have his quote, but here's a map of the zones. Non-assimilationist Muslims establish enclaves and carry out as much of Sharia law as they can without regard for the laws of the democratic countries providing them a new home. Yeah, please.
We also have had at the Naval Academy some contact with a group that is talking about Sharia threat to America. So there are similar processes in the United States that are ongoing. And specifically in that particular movement in the United States, there's been a big focus on prisons and whether or not a special requests for Muslim prisoners are affecting, U.S. constitutional values.
So if we had time, we could talk more about the evidence that we have in our paper of the reality of the no-go zones. We actually have a video, but we don't have time to show it. So just to cite a couple of the numbers, the Economic Cooperation and Development Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development found that the median household immigrant income in France is in the bottom half of all OECD countries and is 31% lower than native-born residents, and only 58% of foreign-born population is employed in France. So there's a chart, no, it's not working, that I have. Maybe we'll get to it in a minute. So there's a graph, maybe it's on this one. No. Okay. Well, I have a graph in the paper, but let me read. According to a recent report published by the Berkeley Center at Georgetown University, Muslims face discrimination in the job market in France, having to apply for employment at 5 times the rate of non-Muslims in order to secure a single interview. The state of emergency in France targeted Muslims in 99% of the cases. And being black or Arab in France makes people 20 to 30 times more likely to be racially profiled by the police. So,
Can I just say,
please.
you can probably see some parallels to the conversations going on in this country as we sort through questions of race and identity and equality. And so I don't think France is alone in having these conversations. But the point is that as democracies, where the values of equality are enshrined in both the political culture and the laws, questions about minority rights take on new meaning and do require conversations that are sometimes difficult.
So what we found perhaps even more remarkable in light of this record of discrimination, the huge evidence of the flight of Muslims for France, France's long history of colonialism in Syria, Algeria, Tunisia, and now Mali, is the accusation of Macron that the cause of radical Islamist terrorism to France is the importation of critical theory into French academics from the United States. So his Minister of Higher Education, Frédéric Vidal, stated in a televised interview on C News, which I'm told is the equivalent of Fox News in France, that Islamo-leftism corrupts all of society and universities are not impervious. She announced that she would be requesting that the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique, CRNS, to investigate on whether research on race, gender, and social class in France was being done. And the reason she said was because she was extremely shocked to see a Confederate flag appear on Capitol in Washington, D.C. Just a few months later, in October 2020 interview, Jean-Michel Blanquer, Macron's Minister of Education, stated that Islamo-leftism wreaks havoc in universities, and he went on to blame the Union Nationale des Étudiants de France of being the intellectual perpetuator of the assassination of Samuel Paty. And you can see on one side we listed the, I guess you could see the pro column, and on the other side is the against column. So, yeah, let me just say this one more thing.
Okay.
So, ironically, what is being exported to France from the United States is not critical race theory, but rather the politicization of intersectionality studies. Just as Macron seems to have adopted from the American media the concept of Islamist no-go zones in France, he seems to have learned the idea of blaming terrorism on French Islamo-leftists from the American politicization of critical race theory.
So this project will have expanded implications. One of the ongoing questions is why are democracies increasingly polarized, and why, through the electoral process, are we seeing swings to the right? Why are democracies increasingly faced with anti-immigrant narratives, anti-immigrant violence, and, again, expressions at the polls? We are interested to see and to watch where this process will go. And I just want to say that one of the things that I keep thinking about is, like, what does it mean to be French? And I know that in last year's competition, 2021, a Tunisian who had come to France as an illegal immigrant won the Best Baguette Award, and he would therefore be able to produce baguette for a year for the president. In doing a little bit of research, I found that a Tunisian also won in 2018 and 2013. So the question is, does this epitomize what republicanism means for Muslims in France, that you would be able to win the Best Baguette Award? Another concern that we are looking at is the idea of, and this came out of our most recent fieldwork in Paris, the secularization of Islam. Do you make Islam French by secularizing it and therefore trying to undo the same processes that lead to Muslim political violence throughout the country? we have seen throughout Middle Eastern history that when people try to secularize or sort of top-down redefine Islam, that ends up creating revolutionary energy. So I have some concerns about whether or not this would be the best approach to trying to reintegrate French society. But it's an issue to continue to look at. And there is a new institute that is going to be responsible for creating and promoting French Islam, that it happens to be at a new university in what is considered a no-go zone. So it's very interesting to see a large investment of capital. We went to this absolutely gorgeous, it was like going to Education City in Qatar. The facilities were amazing. But it will be interesting to see if this effort can have the desire in protecting French republicanism that the government intends. And we'll just leave it there. Unless you had something to say. Okay, thank you.